My son froze my bank accounts to protect me, so I planned a counterattack that left him speechless. The phone call came at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee in my quiet kitchen. My son Marcus's name flashed on the screen, and for a split second, I felt that familiar warmth every parent knows. Maybe he was calling to check in, maybe he needed advice about his new apartment, or maybe he just wanted to hear his old man's voice. I was wrong about all three. Dad, we need to talk about your spending. His voice carried that tone I'd learned to recognize over the past year, the one that made me feel like I was being scolded by my own child. I've been looking at your bank statements, and frankly, I'm concerned about your decision-making. I set down my coffee mug, the ceramic clicking against the granite countertop I'd installed myself 15 years ago. Marcus, what are you talking about? How did you see my bank statements? That's not the point right now. The point is you're spending money on things you don't need. Expensive dinners, new clothes, that ridiculous vacation you booked to Costa Rica. Dad, you're 72 years old. You need to be more responsible with your finances. The words hit me like cold water. I looked around my kitchen, at the home I'd built with my own hands, at the life I'd created through decades of careful planning and hard work. Responsible with my finances? I'd been responsible with money since before Marcus was born, saving every penny to give him the best life possible. Marcus, I earned that money. I saved for 40 years, I planned for retirement, and now I'm finally able to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Why is that a problem? Because you're not thinking clearly anymore, Dad. You're making impulsive decisions, and someone needs to protect you from yourself. I've already spoken with Sarah about this. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd somehow convinced my son that his father was losing his mind, simply because I'd started living my life instead of just existing in it. The woman who'd been dropping hints for months about how I was getting too old to manage my own affairs. What exactly did you discuss with Sarah? We've decided that for your own protection, we're going to freeze your accounts temporarily, just until we can sit down together and create a proper budget for your retirement years. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. My own son, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd put through college, was telling me he was going to control my money like I was some kind of invalid who couldn't be trusted with his own life savings. You're going to do what? Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We love you and we're worried about you. The spending has gotten out of control and we just want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of. Like I was a child who needed supervision. Like 40 years of building a successful construction company meant nothing. Like the careful financial planning that had created a comfortable retirement fund was somehow evidence of incompetence rather than wisdom. Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not incompetent. I am not confused. And I am certainly not going to let my own son freeze my bank accounts because he disagrees with how I choose to spend my own money. I'm sorry you feel that way, Dad, but the decision has already been made. We'll talk more about this when you've had time to cool down. The line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, phone in hand, staring at the black screen that had just delivered the most insulting conversation of my entire life. My son, my own flesh and blood, had just informed me that he was taking control of my finances because I'd committed the terrible crime of actually enjoying my retirement. The Costa Rica trip he'd mentioned. I'd booked it 3 weeks ago after months of research. It was a photography expedition to the cloud forests, something I'd dreamed about since I was young, but never had time for while building my business and raising my family. The expensive dinners? I'd been taking myself out to nice restaurants because after 40 years of brown bag lunches and home cooking, I'd decided I deserved to taste something extraordinary. The new clothes? I'd bought myself a few decent outfits because I was tired of looking like someone who'd given up on life. But in Marcus's mind, these weren't the actions of a man finally living his dreams. They were evidence of mental decline. I walked to my home office and opened my laptop, logging into my bank account with fingers that trembled slightly from anger rather than age. The balance stared back at me. $847,000 in checking and savings, plus retirement accounts worth another $1.2 million. Money I'd earned, money I'd saved, money I'd invested wisely for decades. Money that was apparently no longer mine to control. I tried to transfer $1,000 to my travel account for some upcoming expenses. Transaction denied. Account frozen pending review. My own son had actually done it. He'd somehow convinced the bank to freeze my accounts based on what? Concern for my mental state? Fear that I might enjoy the money I'd worked my entire life to accumulate? I sat back in my leather chair, the same chair I'd used to plan construction projects for 30 years, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not sadness, not disappointment, but something much colder and more focused. Strategic thinking. The same analytical mind that had built a $1 million business from nothing was now turning its attention to a very different kind of problem. Marcus thought he was protecting me from my own poor judgment. He thought he was the responsible adult making hard decisions for his declining father. He thought he understood money better than the man who'd taught him everything he knew about financial planning. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was on all 3 counts. I opened a new browser tab and began typing. Private investigator, asset management, legal consultation. If Marcus wanted to play games with my money, I'd show him what happened when you challenge someone who'd spent 4 decades outmaneuvering competitors, managing complex budgets, and solving problems that seemed impossible. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Dad, we know you're upset, but this is really for the best. We can discuss a reasonable allowance for your daily expenses once everyone has calmed down. An allowance? My daughter-in-law was offering me an allowance from my own money. I deleted the message without responding and returned to my computer. Within an hour, I'd scheduled consultations with 3 different attorneys, a financial advisor who specialized in asset protection, and a private investigator whose website promised discretion and results. Marcus had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that freezing my bank accounts would leave me helpless and dependent on his generosity. What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for unexpected financial emergencies my entire adult life. Hidden assets, emergency funds, investment accounts he'd never heard of. The frozen accounts represented about 60% of my liquid wealth. The other 40% was still very much under my control. I spent the afternoon making phone calls and scheduling appointments, my mind working through possibilities and strategies with the same precision I'd once used to estimate construction costs and manage project timelines. By evening, I had a plan that was both elegant and devastating. Marcus wanted to control my spending because he thought I was wasting money on frivolous luxuries. Sarah apparently agreed that I needed supervision and limits on my financial freedom. They'd taken action to protect me from myself, freezing my accounts and planning to dole out allowances like I was some kind of dependent relative. But they'd overlooked something crucial in their well-intentioned intervention. They'd assumed that an old man would simply accept their judgment and be grateful for their guidance. They were about to discover that their father wasn't as helpless as they'd imagined, and more importantly, they were going to learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions are motivated by love and concern. The Costa Rica photography expedition they'd cited as evidence of my poor judgment, that was just the beginning. I'd been dreaming small, planning modestly, living carefully even in retirement because old habits die hard. But if Marcus and Sarah thought my previous spending was irresponsible, they were about to see what truly irresponsible looked like. I had 40% of my wealth still at my disposal, and I was about to use every penny of it to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The war they'd started by freezing my accounts was going to end with me showing them exactly what their father was capable of when he stopped playing by their rules and started playing by his own. The first meeting was with Jonathan Reeves, senior partner at Reeves, Mitchell & Associates, the kind of law firm that occupied 3 floors of downtown's most expensive building. His office overlooked the city I'd helped build, crane by crane, project by project. Back when my hands were calloused and my back was strong enough to carry more than just the weight of family disappointment. Mr. Patterson, Jonathan said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, your son has made a significant miscalculation here. These account freezes require either a court order based on proven mental incapacity or your voluntary agreement to joint account management. Since you clearly haven't agreed to anything and there's no court involvement, what we're looking at is financial elder abuse. The term hit me like a sledgehammer. Financial elder abuse committed by my own son. The irony is profound, Jonathan continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Your son believes he's protecting you from financial exploitation, but he's actually the one doing the exploiting. We can have these freezes lifted within 48 hours, and potentially pursue charges if you choose to go that route. I leaned forward in the leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jonathan, I appreciate the legal options, but I'm not interested in destroying my son. I'm interested in educating him. Jonathan's smile was sharp as a razor blade. Education can take many forms, Mr. Patterson. What exactly did you have in mind? That's where the second meeting came in. Patricia Chen had built her financial advisory practice around one simple principle: protecting wealth from family members who thought they knew better than their elders. Her downtown office was smaller than Jonathan's, but somehow felt more powerful, lined with awards and testimonials from clients who'd successfully navigated family financial conflicts. Mr. Patterson, she said after reviewing my portfolio, your son has acted on incomplete information. He sees 60% of your assets and assumes that's everything. He doesn't know about the offshore accounts, the precious metals investments, or the real estate holdings in your business name. Exactly. I'd been thorough in my retirement planning, perhaps more thorough than Marcus realized. The frozen accounts were substantial, but they were far from everything. Patricia pulled up a spreadsheet on her computer. Based on what you've shown me, you have approximately $340,000 in immediately accessible funds that your son can't touch. That's more than enough to make your point, whatever that point might be. My point, Patricia, is that my son needs to understand the difference between a father who's lost his judgment and a father who's finally found his freedom. And sometimes the best education comes through demonstration rather than explanation. The third meeting was with David Torres, a private investigator whose business card simply read, Information and Solutions. His office was deliberately unremarkable, tucked between a tax preparation service and a Thai restaurant in a strip mall that had seen better decades. David's specialty was what he called family intelligence gathering. Not the kind of spying that destroyed relationships, but the careful research that revealed the full picture of family dynamics and financial situations. Your son and daughter-in-law, David said, sliding a thin folder across his desk. Marcus works in middle management at Henderson Financial, pulls down about $78,000 a year. Sarah's a part-time marketing coordinator, maybe $35,000 annually. They've got a mortgage on a house they bought 2 years ago for $485,000, monthly payments around $3,200. I opened the folder, scanning documents that painted a picture of my son's financial reality. Credit card debt, car payments, student loans that wouldn't be paid off for another 15 years. Here's what's interesting, David continued. They've been discussing your finances for months. Not just recently, but going back to last Christmas when you mentioned the Costa Rica trip. Sarah's been researching elder care attorneys and financial conservatorship procedures since February. The words settled in my chest like cold stones. This wasn't a recent concern about my spending. This had been planned, researched, strategically implemented. My son and daughter-in-law had been plotting to take control of my money for the better part of a year. There's more, David said. Sarah's been talking to her friends about it. Social media posts about the challenges of dealing with aging parents who don't understand their limitations. She's been building a narrative about your declining mental state for months. I closed the folder, my hands steady despite the rage building behind my ribs. David, I need you to keep monitoring their communications. Legal and ethical monitoring only, but I want to know what they're planning next. Of course. And Mr. Patterson? Based on what I've seen, you might want to move quickly on whatever you're planning. They're not done with the account freezes. Sarah's been researching full financial conservatorship procedures. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of the good whiskey, the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. This felt special enough. Around me, the house held 47 years of memories, from the day Martha and I had signed the mortgage papers to the afternoon I'd scattered her ashes in the garden she'd loved. Marcus had grown up in this house, learned to ride his bike in the driveway, brought his first girlfriend home for dinner at the kitchen table I'd built with my own hands. I'd taught him about money in this living room, explaining compound interest and the importance of saving when he was barely old enough to understand addition. Now that same boy, grown into a man with his own financial struggles, had decided that his father was too old and foolish to manage the money he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Dad, we've scheduled a family meeting for this weekend to discuss your financial situation. Please don't make any major purchases before then. We just want what's best for you. I deleted the message and opened my laptop, navigating to the travel website I'd bookmarked earlier that week. Costa Rica had been just the beginning, a modest dream I'd finally allowed myself to pursue. But if Marcus thought that trip was evidence of poor judgment, he was about to see what real poor judgment looked like. The first booking was simple: a luxury African safari tour, 3 weeks traversing Kenya and Tanzania with private guides and 5-star accommodations. Cost $47,000 for a single traveler, including first-class flights and every amenity imaginable. The second booking required a phone call to a specialty travel agency in Switzerland. A month-long photography expedition to Antarctica, complete with professional-grade camera equipment rental and private helicopter transfers to locations most tourists never saw. Cost $89,000. The third booking was pure indulgence, a culinary tour of Japan spanning 6 weeks, featuring private cooking lessons with master chefs, stays at traditional ryokans, and access to restaurants that normal mortals waited years to experience. Cost $52,000. 3 bookings, 3 dreams I'd never allowed myself to pursue during my working years. Total cost $188,000 of the money Marcus thought I was too irresponsible to manage. But I wasn't finished. The fourth booking was the masterpiece, the purchase that would teach my son exactly what happened when he underestimated his father's capacity for strategic thinking. I opened a new browser tab and began searching for something I'd never imagined buying, but suddenly couldn't resist. A luxury yacht charter in the Mediterranean. Not just any yacht, but a 150-foot vessel complete with crew, gourmet chef, and itinerary that included Monaco, the French Riviera, and the Greek islands. 6 weeks of absolute luxury, the kind of extravagance that would make Marcus's Costa Rica concerns look like complaints about buying expensive coffee. The price made me pause for exactly 3 seconds, $240 on it for 6 weeks, including all expenses, crew tips, and fuel costs. I clicked Reserve Now and entered my credit card information from one of the accounts Marcus had never heard of. Confirmation arrived in my email within minutes, along with detailed itineraries, crew biographies, and a personal phone number for the yacht's concierge service. Total spending for the evening, $428. 4 trips, 4 adventures, 4 opportunities to live the life I'd earned through decades of discipline and sacrifice. Money that would be spent on experiences rather than sitting in accounts where my son could freeze them whenever he decided I was making poor choices. I raised my whiskey glass to the empty living room, to Martha's photo on the mantelpiece, to the life I was finally brave enough to live without asking anyone's permission. Marcus wanted to protect me from my own financial irresponsibility. Tomorrow, he was going to discover exactly what irresponsible looked like when a man with $340,000 in accessible funds decided to stop caring about other people's opinions of his spending habits. The war he'd started by freezing my accounts was about to escalate in ways he'd never imagined. And the best part? Everything I'd just purchased was completely legal, entirely my choice, and absolutely beyond his power to stop. Let him try to freeze accounts that were already empty. The confirmation emails kept arriving throughout the night, each one a small victory against my son's assumption that I needed his protection. By morning, I had a paper trail that would give Marcus heart palpitations when he discovered it. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I made coffee in the same kitchen where he'd delivered his ultimatum, the morning light streaming through windows that had watched me raise him, from a boy who asked for help with math homework to a man who thought he could manage my finances better than I could. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. My phone rang at exactly 8:30. Marcus right on schedule. Dad, we need to discuss your behavior yesterday. Sarah checked your credit report this morning, and there's been some unusual activity. You made several large purchases that frankly concern us even more. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Marcus, those purchases were made with money you can't freeze, from accounts you don't know about, using credit lines I established decades before you learned to spell responsibility. That's exactly what we're worried about. You're not thinking clearly. A yacht charter? Dad, you get seasick on fishing boats. Actually, Marcus, I get seasick on small boats in rough water. A 150-foot yacht with professional crew and stabilizers is an entirely different experience. But you wouldn't know that because you've never asked about my dreams, only my spending. This is getting out of hand. Sarah and I have scheduled an appointment with an elder care attorney for Friday. We're going to explore conservatorship options. The word hit like a physical blow. Conservatorship. The legal mechanism that would strip away every right I'd earned as an adult, reducing me to the status of a child who needed court-appointed supervision for every financial decision. You want to take me to court, Marcus? You want a judge to declare me mentally incompetent because I bought myself some vacation packages? We want to protect you from yourself before you spend every penny you've saved on ridiculous fantasies. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision, my construction worker's hand steady despite the rage building in my chest. Marcus, let me tell you about fantasies. For 40 years, I fantasized about taking your mother to Africa to see the animals she loved watching on nature documentaries. I never did it because I was too busy saving money for your college education. I fantasized about learning to cook authentic Japanese cuisine, but I spent those years working overtime to pay for your baseball camps and music lessons. I fantasized about seeing the northern lights from a ship in Antarctica, but I was building a nest egg so you'd never have to worry about money the way I did when I was young. Dad, we appreciate everything you sacrificed, but no, Marcus, you don't appreciate it. If you appreciated it, you'd understand that I've earned the right to stop sacrificing. I've earned the right to turn my fantasies into reality while I'm still healthy enough to enjoy them. At your age, spending nearly $500,000 on vacation packages isn't turning fantasies into reality. It's financial suicide. The conversation ended there, not because I hung up, but because I started laughing. Deep, genuine laughter that came from somewhere I hadn't accessed in years. Financial suicide. My son thought that spending money on experiences was equivalent to destroying my future. What he didn't understand was that I'd already secured my future. The frozen accounts, the ones he thought represented my entire financial world, were just the visible portion of a much larger iceberg. 40 years of careful planning had created multiple layers of financial security that Marcus had never suspected existed. I walked to my home office and pulled out a manila folder I hadn't opened in 2 years. Inside were statements from investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business partnerships that had been generating passive income for decades. Money that Marcus had never seen because I'd never needed to touch it. The Costa Rica trip that had started this whole mess. That had been funded from my discretionary spending account, the money I allowed myself each month for entertainment and hobbies. The yacht charter and safari bookings, those came from a travel fund I'd been building for 15 years, waiting for the courage to actually use it. But Marcus saw large purchases and assumed financial recklessness. He saw an old man spending money and concluded mental decline. What he couldn't see was the systematic approach, the careful planning, the decades of financial discipline that made these purchases not just affordable, but almost insignificant in the context of my overall wealth. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Dad, we've been researching memory care facilities just in case your condition worsens. There are some lovely places that specialize in financial oversight for seniors with judgment issues. Memory care facilities, they were already planning my imprisonment. I deleted the message and opened my laptop, navigating to a website I'd bookmarked earlier that morning. If Marcus and Sarah wanted to see real financial irresponsibility, I was prepared to show them exactly what that looked like. The Pebble Beach golf course in California had a package I'd been admiring for months. Not just a round of golf, but a week-long experience including private lessons with a PGA professional, luxury accommodations at the lodge, and access to tournaments that most golfers could only dream of attending. Cost? $35,000? I booked it without hesitation. Next came something I'd never imagined purchasing, but suddenly couldn't resist. A vintage Porsche 911, fully restored, sitting in a collector's showroom in Beverly Hills. The kind of car I'd admired in magazines during my working years, but never allowed myself to consider buying. Cost? $127,000. I called the dealership directly. Mr. Patterson, the salesman said after I'd explained what I wanted. That particular vehicle is a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS. It's been completely restored with original parts and documentation. Are you interested in financing options? No financing necessary. I'll wire the full amount today if you can arrange delivery to my home address. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the connection had dropped. Sir, did you say you want to wire the full purchase price today? That's exactly what I said. I'm 72 years old, I've been admiring cars like this for 50 years, and I've finally decided to stop admiring and start owning. The paperwork was surprisingly simple when money wasn't an issue. Wire transfer instructions, insurance documentation, delivery arrangements. By noon, I owned a piece of automotive history that would be sitting in my driveway within 48 hours. But I still wasn't finished. The third purchase required another phone call, this time to a wine auction house in Napa Valley. For 20 years, I'd been reading about vintage wines, learning about vineyards and harvest years, understanding the subtle differences that made certain bottles worth more than most people's monthly salaries. I'd never bought expensive wine because it seemed frivolous, impractical, the kind of luxury that responsible people avoided. But responsibility was apparently what Marcus thought I'd lost, so perhaps it was time to embrace irresponsibility with both hands. The auction house had a collection coming up for sale. Rare Bordeaux wines from legendary vintages, bottles that had been properly stored for decades, waiting for someone with enough appreciation and resources to give them the homes they deserved. I bid on 12 bottles, each one representing a year of particular significance in my life. The year I married Martha, the year Marcus was born, the year I landed my biggest construction contract, the year Martha died. Liquid history, preserved in glass and cork, waiting to be opened during moments that deserved celebration. Total cost, $89,000 for 12 bottles of wine that most people would consider insane to purchase. The afternoon brought another call from Marcus, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic I remembered from his teenage years when he'd gotten caught doing something he knew was wrong. Dad, what's this about a Porsche? The bank called because there was a large wire transfer to a car dealership in California. I bought myself a car, Marcus, 72 years old, and I finally bought myself the car I always wanted, but never allowed myself to have. You don't even drive anymore except to the grocery store and doctor's appointments. That's because I never had anywhere exciting to drive. Now I have a Porsche and reservations at some of the most beautiful places on earth. Seems like a perfect combination to me. This is exactly what we're talking about, Dad. These aren't rational decisions. You're spending money on things you don't need, things that don't make sense for someone your age. Marcus, when you were 8 years old, you wanted a bicycle with special racing stripes. It cost twice as much as a regular bike, and you didn't need racing stripes to get to school or ride around the neighborhood. But I bought it for you because I wanted you to have something that made you happy. Now I'm buying things that make me happy, and you're telling me it doesn't make sense. That's different. I was a child. Exactly. You were a child, and children deserve to have their dreams fulfilled by adults who love them. Now, I'm an adult fulfilling my own dreams with money I earned and saved specifically for this purpose. The silence on his end told me he was calculating, trying to figure out how much damage I could do with whatever resources he hadn't managed to freeze. What he didn't realize was that the visible damage was nothing compared to what I was actually capable of. Dad, please promise me you won't make any more major purchases until we can sit down and talk about this properly. I can't make that promise, Marcus, because I don't believe you have any right to control how I spend my money. But I will make you a different promise. What's that? I promise that every dollar I spend will be on something that brings me joy, fulfills a dream I've been postponing, or creates an experience I've always wanted to have. And I promise that when I'm done spending, you'll understand exactly what your father is capable of when he stops asking permission to live his own life. The line went dead, but this time I was the one who'd ended the call. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, not one of the expensive bottles I'd just purchased, but a simple red from the local grocery store. Around me, the house felt different somehow, charged with the electricity of change and possibility. Martha's photo smiled at me from the mantelpiece, and I raised my glass to her memory. "Sweetheart," I said aloud, "our boy thinks I've lost my mind because I'm finally living the life we always talked about. Maybe he's right. Maybe I have lost my mind. But if this is what insanity feels like, I should have gone crazy years ago." My laptop chimed with new emails, confirmation for the golf package, shipping information for the wine collection, delivery schedule for the Porsche. Each message was a small rebellion against the idea that age meant accepting limitations instead of embracing possibilities. Tomorrow would bring another call from Marcus, probably with Sarah coaching him from the background, definitely with more threats about legal action and conservatorship proceedings. They would continue to see my purchases as evidence of declining judgment rather than evidence of a man who'd finally found the courage to live without apology. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their campaign to protect me from myself. They thought that freezing my visible accounts would leave me helpless and dependent on their guidance. Instead, they'd freed me from any remaining sense of obligation to justify my choices to people who couldn't understand the difference between reckless spending and intentional living. The war was far from over, and I was just getting started. The next morning brought a knock at my door that wasn't entirely unexpected. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on my front porch with Sarah beside him, both wearing the kind of serious expressions usually reserved for funeral homes and tax audits. I opened the door with my coffee in hand, noting how they both looked like they'd rehearsed this moment. Marcus wore his best suit, the one I'd helped him buy for job interviews 5 years ago. Sarah carried a manila folder thick enough to contain legal documents. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "You're up early for a Wednesday?" "Dad, we need to come in and discuss your recent behavior." Sarah's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence rather than charm. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room where I'd raised Marcus from a boy who believed his father could fix anything to a man who thought his father couldn't manage a checkbook. "The coffee's fresh if you want some," I offered, settling into my recliner. Marcus perched on the edge of the couch like he was afraid to get comfortable. "Dad, we've done some research, and we think you might be experiencing what experts call late-onset financial disinhibition. It's a recognized condition that affects judgment about money and spending." I sipped my coffee, letting the medical terminology wash over me like background noise. Financial disinhibition. They'd found a clinical name for happiness. Sarah opened her folder with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced this presentation. "We've consulted with Dr. Martinez, a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in cognitive decline in older adults. She's agreed to evaluate your mental state based on your recent purchasing patterns." "Purchasing patterns," I repeated. "You mean buying things I want with money I earned?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression mixing concern with frustration. "Dad, in the past week you've spent over $600,000 on vacations, cars, wine, and golf packages. That's not normal behavior for someone your age." Normal behavior. I looked around the living room where normal behavior had kept me trapped for 2 years after Martha's death, where normal behavior meant watching television alone every evening and pretending that existing was the same thing as living. "Marcus, when you were 16, you spent $300 on a pair of basketball shoes because Michael Jordan wore them. You didn't play basketball competitively, you didn't need shoes that expensive, and $300 was a significant amount of money for our family at that time. But I bought them for you because you wanted them." "That's completely different," Sarah interjected. "You were providing for your child's needs." "No, Sarah. I was providing for my child's wants because I loved him enough to turn his wants into reality when I could afford to do so. Now I'm doing the same thing for myself, and somehow that's evidence of mental illness." "Dr. Martinez has experience with exactly this kind of situation," Marcus said, pulling out a business card. "Elderly individuals who begin making impulsive, expensive purchases often benefit from professional evaluation and structured financial oversight." I set down my coffee and looked at both of them. These two people who thought they understood my mental state better than I did. "Tell me something, Marcus. What was the last dream you gave up because you thought it was impractical?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, exactly what I asked. What's something you wanted to do, somewhere you wanted to go, something you wanted to experience, but you decided against it because it seemed too expensive or too frivolous or too something?" "I don't see how that's relevant to your spending spree," Sarah said. But Marcus was thinking, his face cycling through expressions I recognized from his childhood when he was working through complex problems. "I always wanted to learn to fly," he said finally. "Take pilot lessons, maybe buy a small plane someday. But it's expensive, and we have the mortgage and Sarah's student loans, and it just doesn't make financial sense right now." I nodded slowly. "And how long have you wanted to learn to fly?" "Since I was probably 10 years old. You took me to that air show, remember? And I saw those small planes doing aerobatics, and I thought it was the most amazing thing in the world." 32 years, I said. You've wanted to learn to fly for 32 years, but you haven't done it because other things seemed more important, more responsible, more practical. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. That's called being a responsible adult, Dad. Making choices based on priorities and long-term planning. No, Sarah. That's called postponing your life until some imaginary future when everything else is taken care of and you finally have permission to pursue your dreams. I did that for 40 years. I postponed Africa until retirement. I postponed learning to cook authentic Japanese food until I had more free time. I postponed buying a beautiful car until I could afford it without affecting anyone else's financial security. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway where my new Porsche would be delivered tomorrow. The same driveway where I'd taught Marcus to change oil and check tire pressure, where I'd watched him drive away to college with everything I could give him packed into the back of a sensible sedan. The difference between us, Marcus, is that I finally reached that imaginary future. I have more free time. I can afford beautiful things without affecting anyone else's security. I have permission from the only person whose opinion matters about my life, which is me. But Dad, Marcus said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining reality to a confused child. At 72, you need to think about healthcare costs, potential assisted living expenses, emergency funds for unexpected situations. You can't just spend money like there's no tomorrow. I turned back to face them, these two people who thought they were protecting me from myself. Marcus, I've thought about healthcare costs. I've planned for assisted living expenses. I've maintained emergency funds that could cover unexpected situations for the next 20 years. The money I'm spending represents less than 30% of my total assets, and I'm spending it on experiences that will enrich my life while I'm still healthy enough to enjoy them. Sarah consulted her folder again. According to our research, elderly individuals often overestimate their financial resources and underestimate their future needs. Dr. Martinez has case studies showing how cognitive decline can manifest as overconfidence in financial planning. Case studies, I repeated. Dr. Martinez has case studies about people like me who think they can afford to live their dreams instead of just existing in comfortable poverty. That's not what we're saying, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying that wanting to see elephants in Kenya is evidence of mental illness. You're saying that buying a car I've admired for 50 years proves I can't think clearly. You're saying that purchasing wine to celebrate significant moments in my life demonstrates cognitive decline. I walked back to my chair, noting how both of them watched me like they were documenting my movements for their psychiatric evaluation. The irony was breathtaking. They were studying my behavior for signs of incompetence while demonstrating their own inability to understand the difference between reckless spending and intentional living. Let me ask you both something, I said, settling back into my recliner. If I died tomorrow, what would happen to all the money you're so worried about me spending? Marcus looked uncomfortable. It would go to my estate, distributed according to your will. And what would you do with your inheritance? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire they hadn't expected. Sarah glanced at Marcus, then back at me, clearly calculating whether honesty was the best strategy. We'd probably pay off our mortgage, Marcus said slowly. Maybe take a vacation we've been postponing. Set aside money for future children's college expenses. So you'd use my money to eliminate debt and create experiences and secure your family's future. But when I use my money for the same purposes while I'm alive to enjoy the benefits, that's evidence of mental illness. It's different when you're our age, Sarah said. We have decades to recover from financial mistakes. At 72, you don't have the luxury of time to rebuild your savings if something goes wrong. Sarah, I've been managing money successfully since before you were born. I built a construction company that employed over 50 people at its peak. I planned and executed budgets for projects worth millions of dollars. I've been investing in the stock market for 45 years, and my portfolio has consistently outperformed professional fund managers. The idea that I suddenly lost the ability to understand money the day I decided to spend some of it on myself is insulting to both my intelligence and my experience. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like notes. Dad, we've been tracking your purchases, and the pattern suggests impulsive decision-making rather than careful planning. The yacht charter alone costs more than most people's annual salaries. I watched my son reading from his phone like a prosecutor presenting evidence and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, exactly, but a cold clarity that cut through every remaining vestige of parental guilt. Marcus, stand up. What? Stand up and walk to the kitchen. Open the drawer next to the refrigerator, the one where I keep important papers. He looked confused but followed my instructions, Sarah trailing behind him like a lawyer, afraid her client was about to confess to something damaging. Do you see the manila folder labeled retirement planning? Yes, his voice carried from the kitchen. Bring it here. Marcus returned with a folder I'd been maintaining for 15 years, adding documents and updating projections every few months. I took it from his hands and opened it on the coffee table, spreading out pages of financial statements, investment summaries, and budget projections. This is what careful planning looks like, I said, pointing to the documents. Every purchase I've made in the past week was budgeted for in these projections. The African safari, the Antarctic expedition, the Japanese culinary tour, the Mediterranean yacht charter, the Porsche, the wine collection, the golf package. All of it was planned and calculated and saved for over the course of years. Sarah leaned forward, studying the papers with the expression of someone whose assumptions were crumbling in real time. These projections go back to 2018. 5 years of planning, I confirmed. 5 years of researching experiences I wanted to have, calculating costs, and setting aside money specifically for the purpose of turning dreams into reality. The only impulsive thing about my recent spending is the timing, and that's because you froze my accounts and forced me to accelerate my timeline. Marcus sank back onto the couch, his confident demeanor deflating like a punctured balloon. Dad, why didn't you tell us about this planning? Because you never asked about my plans, Marcus. You asked about my spending. You assumed that because I was buying expensive things, I wasn't thinking clearly. You concluded that because I was pursuing dreams instead of hoarding money, I needed professional supervision. I gathered up the financial documents, returning them to their folder with the same care I'd maintained them for years. The truth is, both of you have been so focused on protecting me from myself that you never bothered to understand what myself actually wanted or needed or deserved. Sarah was reading through her own papers now, her folder of psychiatric research and legal options suddenly seeming less relevant. Dr. Martinez specializes in cases where elderly individuals begin exhibiting unusual financial behavior without apparent planning or consideration of consequences. Exactly, I said. Cases where elderly individuals act impulsively without planning or consideration. That's not me, Sarah. That's never been me. Every dollar I've spent was planned, budgeted, and saved for specifically because I wanted to spend it on experiences that would make my remaining years meaningful instead of just comfortable. Marcus looked up from the couch where he'd been sitting in stunned silence. So you're not having some kind of mental breakdown? No, Marcus. I'm having some kind of mental breakthrough. For the first time since your mother died, I'm living my life instead of just managing it. For the first time in 40 years, I'm pursuing my own dreams instead of funding everyone else's dreams and calling it responsibility. The room fell quiet, except for the tick of the grandfather clock Martha had loved, the one that had measured out years of careful planning and delayed gratification and dreams postponed until someday. But Dad, Sarah said, her voice smaller now, less certain, we were genuinely worried about you. The sudden change in spending patterns, the expensive purchases, it seemed like something was wrong. Something was wrong, I replied. What was wrong was that I'd convinced myself that 72 years old was too late to start living the life I'd always wanted. What was wrong was that I'd accepted the idea that being a responsible adult meant never doing anything that might seem frivolous or impractical to other people. I looked at both of them, these two people who'd tried to save me from the terrible fate of enjoying my own money. Marcus, the son I'd raised to be responsible and careful and considerate of others. Sarah, the daughter-in-law who'd married into a family where financial security was valued above almost everything else. The spending isn't going to stop, I said quietly. I have reservations for experiences that will take me around the world over the next 2 years. I have deposits on adventures I've been dreaming about since I was young enough to think they were impossible. I'm going to spend money on beautiful things and meaningful experiences until either the money runs out or I do. Marcus started to object, but I held up my hand. But I'm going to do it according to the plan I've been developing for 5 years. I'm going to do it with the same careful consideration I've applied to every major financial decision in my adult life. And I'm going to do it with or without your approval, because approval from my children is not a prerequisite for living my own life. Sarah closed her folder of psychiatric research and legal strategies. I think maybe we misunderstood the situation. You misunderstood me, I corrected. You saw an old man making expensive purchases and assumed incompetence, instead of considering that maybe, just maybe, I'd earned the right to turn my dreams into reality while I still had the health and energy to enjoy them. The conversation continued for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of 2 adults confronting a confused elderly man, we were 3 people discussing different approaches to financial planning and life priorities. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my budget projections. Sarah admitted that some of my planned experiences sounded amazing rather than irresponsible. When they finally left, Marcus hugged me at the door with something that felt like respect rather than condescending concern. Dad, I'm sorry we tried to control your spending without understanding your planning. You were trying to protect me, I said. I appreciate the intention even if I disagreed with the execution. After they drove away, I sat in my quiet house with a sense of victory that felt different from anything I'd experienced in business. This wasn't about outsmarting competitors or landing profitable contracts. This was about reclaiming the right to live my own life according to my own values and priorities. My phone rang an hour later. Marcus's name on the caller ID. Dad, I called the bank about the frozen accounts. They'll be unfrozen by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Marcus. And Dad? Sarah and I were talking in the car. We think maybe we should take that pilot lesson I mentioned. Life's too short to keep postponing everything that makes us happy. I smiled, looking out at the driveway where my Porsche would arrive tomorrow, thinking about the adventures waiting for me in Kenya and Antarctica and Japan and the Mediterranean. Life's too short, I agreed. And dreams don't get easier to pursue just because we get older. That night, I opened a bottle of wine. Not one of the expensive vintages I'd purchased at auction, but a simple red from the local store. I raised my glass to Martha's photograph, to the empty house that would soon be filled with souvenirs from around the world, to the man I'd finally found the courage to become. The war was over, and for the first time in years, I felt like I'd truly won. 6 months later, I was sitting on the deck of a luxury yacht anchored off the coast of Monaco, watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean in shades of gold and crimson that no photograph could ever capture. The gentle rocking of the vessel beneath my feet felt like the world's most expensive lullaby. And for the first time in decades, I understood what peace actually meant. The yacht's captain, a weathered Frenchman named Henri, approached with my evening espresso. Monsieur Patterson, we will dock in Cannes tomorrow morning. Your hotel suite overlooks the harbor, and the restaurant has confirmed your reservation for lunch. I thanked him and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the hundreds of photos I'd taken over the past month. Elephants crossing the Serengeti at dawn, their massive silhouettes etched against a sky that looked like watercolors. The northern lights dancing above Antarctica, green ribbons of light that made me understand why ancient cultures believed in magic. A master chef in Tokyo teaching me to prepare sushi with movements so precise they bordered on meditation. Each image told the story of a man who'd finally learned the difference between existing and living. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dad, saw your photos from Italy. The pasta making class looked incredible. Sarah and I start flying lessons next week. Can't wait to show you what we learn. I typed back quickly. Send photos from your first solo flight. I'll be in the Greek islands by then, but I want to see everything. The response came immediately. Love you, Dad. Thanks for teaching us that dreams don't have expiration dates. I set the phone aside and sipped my espresso, thinking about the conversation that had started this whole journey. Marcus freezing my accounts because he thought I was losing my mind. The painful realization that my own son saw financial responsibility and personal happiness as mutually exclusive concepts. But the real revelation had been simpler than either of us expected. Money wasn't just numbers in an account or security for some uncertain future. Money was freedom. The freedom to choose experiences over possessions, adventure over safety, living over merely surviving. Tomorrow I would dock in Cannes, then fly to Athens for the final leg of my Mediterranean adventure. Next month, I'd return home to plan the next expedition. The Japanese culinary tour was scheduled for spring, the Antarctic photography expedition for next winter. Each trip carefully budgeted, meticulously planned, and absolutely worth every penny I'd spent on them. The Porsche was waiting in my garage, still smelling like new leather and possibility. The wine collection was properly stored in my climate-controlled cellar, bottles marking milestones I'd finally learned to celebrate instead of simply endure. The golf package at Pebble Beach had introduced me to players who'd become friends, men my age who'd also discovered that retirement could be the beginning of something extraordinary rather than the end of everything meaningful. Henri returned to collect my empty cup. "Monsieur, if I may say, you seem different than when you first boarded. More, how do you say, alive?" I laughed, the sound carrying across the water toward the twinkling lights of Monaco's harbor. "Henri, 6 months ago, my son thought I was losing my mind because I wanted to spend money on experiences instead of leaving it all in bank accounts. Turns out, the only thing I was losing was my fear of actually living." As the yacht rocked gently in the Mediterranean swells, I thought about Marcus and Sarah back home, probably researching flight schools and aircraft rentals, finally understanding that dreams weren't luxuries to be postponed, but necessities to be pursued. The war that began with frozen bank accounts had ended with something far more valuable than money. It had ended with a family that finally understood the difference between being financially responsible and being afraid to live. And sometimes the most expensive lesson you can give your children is showing them that their father isn't ready to stop dreaming just because he's gotten older. The stars began appearing overhead, and I raised my empty espresso cup to the Mediterranean sky, to Martha's memory, and to the man who'd finally learned that the best investment you can make is in your own happiness. The numbers in my bank account were smaller now, but the richness of my life had multiplied beyond anything I could have calculated. And that, I realized, was the only math that really mattered.